Hello and welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. Some time ago, Alex O'Connor, a prominent atheist with multiple social media platforms such as the Cosmic Skeptic YouTube channel, the More Alex O'Connor YouTube channel, and the Within Reason podcast, uploaded a video called Every Argument for Atheism. Alex's video, Every Argument for Atheism, was a response Alex made to a video posted by popular Christian YouTuber Redeem Zoomer. My zeal for God and my love for the lost compels me to respond to some of the things Alex says in his video. Please like, comment, subscribe, and have a blessed rest of your day.
A new, fast-growing Christian YouTube channel, Redeemed Zoomer, put out a video promisingly called All Atheist Arguments Answered in 10 Minutes. Let's see how he does.
Well, drug trips show that spiritual experiences are from the brain. Well, people who have had both drug trips and near-death experiences say that they're completely different categories of feeling.
Sure, but people who take LSD and DMT will tell you that they're totally different experiences too. The point about drugs is just that the brain can sometimes experience inexplicable and ineffable things without necessarily indicating the involvement of anything beyond the materials of the brain.
Today on Blessed Man Meditations, we're going to look at the issue of drug trips and spiritual experiences, and we're going to attempt to answer the question, are drug trips essentially the same as spiritual experiences? In the video, Every Argument for Atheism from Alex O'Connor, the Redeemed Zoomer clip has the atheist saying, drug trips show that spiritual experiences are from the brain. In the Redeemed Zoomer video, the theist responds to the atheist and says that people who have had near-death experiences and drug trips who have had both near-death experiences and drug trips say that they are different. So Alex then responds to Redeemed Zoomer video clip and says that people who take different drugs will likewise say that the experiences one has on different drugs are different also. Alex says on drugs, the brain can experience inexplicable and ineffable things without any involvement from anything other than the materials contained within the brain. To respond to Alex, I'm going to do a couple of responses, at least two. On this Oxford academic website, a scientific study was done comparing people who claim to have had both near-death experiences and psychedelic experiences. So the same people had a psychedelic experience or a drug trip, and they also had a near-death experience. I would encourage you to go to the website found above there and read the entire study as I did yourself. Here's the abstract, a short summary of the study's findings. Mystical-like states of consciousness may arise through means such as psychedelic substances, but may also occur unexpectedly during near-death experiences. So far, research studies comparing experiences induced by psychedelic drugs and NDEs, along with their enduring effects, have employed between-subject designs, limiting direct comparison. So I guess that means they either did one or the other. But this Oxford group did a online survey exploring the phenomenology, attribution of reality, psychological insights, and enduring effects of NDEs and psychedelic experiences in individuals who had both an NDE and a psychedelic experience, or multiple psychedelic experiences. They used frequentist and Bayesian analyses to determine significant differences and overlaps between NDEs and psychedelic experiences. In their scientific study, 31 adults reported having both a near-death experience and a psychedelic experience. The results revealed areas of overlap between both experiences for phenomenology, attribution of reality, psychological insights, and enduring effects. A finer-grained analysis of the phenomenology revealed a significant overlap in mystical-like effects, while low-level phenomena, sensory effects, were significantly different, with NDEs displaying higher scores of disembodiment and psychedelic experiences higher scores of visual imagery. This suggests psychedelics as a useful model for studying mystical-like effects induced by NDEs while highlighting distinctions in sensory experiences. Are they essentially the same? They share some characteristics, but that doesn't mean that they can be explained the same way, that they're essentially the same. So let's define some terms. Frequentist and Bayesian analyses. You can go to this article here. It says both frequentist and Bayesian analyses have The frequentist approach is based on the principle of objective probability, where probability is defined as the long-run frequency of an event occurring throughout repeated experiments. Statistical parameters such as mean and standard deviation are treated as fixed quantities, and probabilities are used to model the behavior of a random sample. Frequentist approach uses p-values, confidence intervals, and hypothesis tests. These concepts all rely on the idea of repeated sampling, where results are interpreted in the context of many hypothetical repetitions of the study. Virtually all introductory statistics courses use frequentist models, as they are generally straightforward to imply and interpret. The Bayesian approach, on the other hand, defines a probability as the degree of belief or certainty in a particular event, which changes when more information becomes available. Bayesian methods allow for the incorporation of prior knowledge, subject expert opinion, and new data to create updated beliefs along with a level of certainty in them. One of the central characteristics of Bayesian statistics is its flexibility to handle complex models and incorporate a range of new information. While frequentist statistics treats parameters as fixed values, Bayesian methods treat them as random variables with their own probability distributions. Common Bayesian techniques include Bayesian regression, hierarchical modeling, and MCMC methods, which allow for estimation in complex models. Bayesian approaches are particularly valuable in situations with limited data or when prior information is available, as they enable researchers to formally include this prior knowledge in the analysis. Key differences. The main difference is how they define and interpret probability. In the frequentist world, probability is objective and represents the long-run frequency of an event occurring. Parameters are fixed and cannot be known. In the Bayesian world, probability is subjective and reflects beliefs and uncertainty about an event. Parameters are random variables and distributions indicating their uncertainty. Another key difference is the use of data. In the frequentist approach, data is considered fixed, and inferences are based on the sampling distribution of the estimator. This means conclusions are drawn based on the assumption of repeated sampling from a fixed unknown population. In contrast, the Bayesian approach uses data to update prior beliefs, integrating both the observed data and prior information to form the posterior distribution. Each approach has its own set of strengths and weaknesses. The frequentist approach is advantageous for its simplicity and widespread acceptance in scientific research. It performs well with large data sets and provides clear decision-making criteria based on p-values and confidence intervals. However, it does not account for prior knowledge and can be rigid in handling complex models. Conversely, Bayesian approach excels in its flexibility and ability to incorporate prior information, making it ideal for analyses with limited data or complex hierarchical structures. The downside is that Bayesian methods can be computationally intensive and require careful consideration of prior distributions, which may introduce subjectivity. Choosing between frequentist and Bayesian approaches depends on several factors, including the availability of prior information, the nature of the data, and the complexity of the model. For example, in clinical trials, since these studies tend to have a small sample size and limited data, the Bayesian approach is preferable because it can allow for inclusion of more prior knowledge, giving more informative results. In quality control, the goal is to set objective thresholds and make decision rules based on repeated sampling, so the frequentist approach should be used. In meta-analysis, the results from previous studies can be used as priors to inform the analysis of new data, so Bayesian methods are well suited for meta-analysis projects. In survey data analysis for large-scale surveys, frequentist methods are often preferred due to their simplicity and established procedures for handling large data sets. To summarize, these are the main differences between the frequentist and Bayesian approaches to statistical inference. We can look at the table there. In many cases, the choice between the frequentist and Bayesian methods may not be mutually exclusive. Hybrid approaches exist that can combine elements of both frameworks. Ultimately, the decision should be guided by the specific context of the analysis, availability of prior information, and the desired interpretability of results. So there is a fairly detailed definition of frequentist and Bayesian analyses to determine So we'll have that as background information as we go through the study. Both of these were used to determine significant differences and overlaps between the effects of psychedelic drugs and near-death experiences. 31 adults in the study reported having experienced both an NDE and a psychedelic experience. The results revealed areas of overlap between both experiences for phenomenology, attribution of reality, psychological insights, and enduring effects. Let's define phenomenology. Phenomenology is the philosophical study and movement largely associated with the early 20th century that seeks to objectively investigate the nature of subjective conscious experience and world disclosure. It attempts to describe the universal features of consciousness while avoiding assumptions about the external world, aiming to describe phenomena as they appear and to explore the meaning and significance of lived experience. And it says this approach, while philosophical, has found many applications in qualitative research across different scientific disciplines, especially in the social sciences, humanities, psychology, and cognitive science, but also in fields as diverse as health sciences, architecture, and human-computer interaction, among many others. The application of phenomenology in these fields aims to gain a deeper understanding of subjective experience rather than focusing on behavior. Now, this is a study about subjective experience. Results revealed areas of overlap between subjective experience, attribution of reality, psychological insights, and enduring effects. A finer-grained analysis of the phenomenology revealed a significant overlap in mystical-like effects, while low-level phenomena sensory effects were significantly different, with NDEs displaying higher scores of disembodiment and psychedelic experiences displaying higher scores of visual imagery. This suggests psychedelics as a useful model for studying mystical-like effects induced by near-death experiences while highlighting distinctions in sensory experiences. The difference between a drug trip and a near-death experience is that a psychedelic experience interacts with a living brain. A near-death experience, by definition, is when the patient is physically dead and their mind separates from their brain, as understands the mind and brain to be separate things, and the near-death experience happens where the patient loses physical life such that they are declared clinically dead, and they experience things that cannot be naturally explained. There are some commonalities between the experiences detailed between people who took psychedelic drugs and who had near-death experiences, but that does not necessarily have to mean that the experiences are essentially the same, since the drug trip happens in a living person and the near-death experience happens in a person who is declared clinically dead, but then comes back from the dead and tells others about their story. This is not considered to be the same in quality as a resurrection from the dead, of course. This is where they temporarily die and experience things that they would not have experienced in the living realm and came back to tell about it. Introduction. There are a variety of means to attain mystical-like and other non-ordinary states of consciousness, including during meditation, during life-threatening events, and while using high doses of psychedelic drugs. The non-materialist. So people take psychedelic drugs to have mystical-like and other non-ordinary states of consciousness. Research suggests that 4% to 8% of the general population has experienced a near-death experience. A classical NDE can be defined as a state of disconnected consciousness, having a subjective experience in a state without connection to the external sensory environment. Now, to me, that sounds to me like a difference between an NDE and a drug experience. I have not had a psychedelic drug experience. In my college days, which are almost 25 years ago now, I did have some experience with marijuana, and one experience in particular was particularly jarring, but I've never had a near-death experience. But only 4 to 8% of the general population has experienced a near-death experience. Now, what's interesting is that this study does not talk about people who have not had drug experiences, but have had near-death experiences. But there are tons of people who have not had drug experiences that have claimed to have near-death experiences. So if the skeptic is going to claim that drug trips are essentially the same as spiritual experiences, how can they say that about the people who have not had drug trips, but yet have had the spiritual experiences? But anyway, again, this study refers to people who have had both. Classical near-death experience can be defined as a state of disconnected consciousness, having a subjective experience in a state without connection to the external sensory environment, with prototypical mystical features typically occurring in individuals in life-threatening contexts. Prototypical features of near-death experiences are out-of-body experiences, meeting entities or beings and seeing a bright light. Other scientific studies have shown that both NDEs and psychedelic experiences share common characteristics, such as similar phenomenological features, enduring changes regarding attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs. In terms of phenomenology, NDEs seem to particularly resemble subjective experiences induced by classic psychedelics, like serotonin DMT, psilocybin, as well as atypical psychedelics such as NMDMA antagonist, ketamine, and K-receptor agonist, salvinorin A. Common features between NDEs and psychedelics may include entering an unearthly environment, profound sense of unity, extrasensory perceptions, and the experience of ego dissolution. However, while NDEs and psychedelic experiences can exhibit many similarities, they seem to not be identical, with some features, such as the experience of a border/point of no return, that are more frequently reported in NDEs. There doesn't have to be a problem for the theist that drug trips from psychedelic drugs can share some common characteristics with spiritual experiences like NDEs. There doesn't have to be a problem, even given the mind being separate from the brain, as the theist should hold, that the materialist likely will not hold. It's not outside of the realm of possibility that God can produce similar effects in the immaterial mind that are produced in the material brain. That doesn't necessarily seem to me to need to be a problem for the theistic view. Simulating the core features of near-death experiences via the use of pharmacological means provides a way to model assumptions regarding the neurophysiological mechanisms underlying these experiences. Yeah, with some limitations. I don't think the scientific endeavor should assume that drugs of any sort can perfectly mimic what people describe as a near-death experience. I don't think drugs are intended to perfectly mimic those things. There are some things in the natural realm that will never be able to perfectly mimic things that are only experienced in the spiritual realm, though some things in the natural realm may be able to come close. Given the similarities between classical or atypical psychedelics and near-death experiences, it could be hypothesized that both serotonergic and glutamatergic mechanisms could underlie core near-death experience features. Of course, if the brain is not active during a near-death experience, then the features of the near-death experience must not have happened during the brain. If the brain is dead during the near-death experience, which doctors, the point of the near-death experience is that doctors declare the patient brain dead. So if the mind produces symptoms and effects that are similar to the drug tripping brain, that doesn't follow that the experience is the spiritual experience is essentially the same as the drug trip, because it's operating on a different mechanism. If the brain is dead, it can't be operating on the brain. Near-death experiences and psychedelic experiences also appear to be similarly life-changing and can profoundly affect people's sense of self, perspectives regarding death, feelings of relatedness with nature, and worldviews. Such impacts, in addition to other factors such as cultural background, can also shape the interpretation of the experience, attribution of meaning, or appraisals of the contents experienced. Therefore, it seems that both types of experiences share common characteristics in terms of not only phenomenology, but also of their enduring impact. However, so far, current research investigating the overlap between near-death experiences and psychedelic experiences is limited, since it consists of studies only performing between-subject comparisons. Between-subject comparisons only provide indirect means to address potential overlaps between near-death experiences and psychedelic experiences, and suffer from spurious, confounding factors across populations like personality traits and cognitive abilities, and an inability for the same individual to serve as their own control, which would enable a direct and less confounded comparison regarding the experience. In the present study, the scientists at Oxford Academic performed a comparison of NDEs and experiences induced by classic psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin, mushrooms, ayahuasca, DMT, or mescaline in people who have experienced both an NDE and a psychedelic experience. We want to look at what they did in this study and see if the data shows that the experiences were essentially the same. When we go through the study, we'll see that there were some differences. But like I said, even for the things that appear to be similar, it doesn't necessarily have to follow the drug trip and spiritual experience were essentially the same. How do you account for the people who've had the spiritual experiences and never did drugs? Unless you're just going to dismiss them as lying, I don't think that that's fair or charitable to the people claiming to have had the experiences. As many materialists claim to be champions of rigorous pursuit of evidence, those materialists shouldn't just dismiss a testimonial tale if the source from which the testimonial tale comes is deemed to be credible, and they can't be dismissed as not credible just because what they say doesn't strictly line up with a material worldview. You have to look at the fruit of the life, the fruit of the one making the claim about the experience. Does the person making the experience have friends and acquaintances that would characterize them as honest, or do they have a reputation for telling fanciful tales? In this scientific study, they used an online survey and a within-subject design to better understand the phenomenological features shared by both NDEs and psychedelic experiences, as well as overlaps pertaining to their appraisals, attribution of reality, ensuing psychological insights and enduring effects. They used frequentist analysis to assess the differences between NDEs and PEs, but also Bayesian analyses to assess overlaps between these experiences. Based on the existing between-subject studies, they expect relatively large overlaps in terms of phenomenology and enduring effects between both types of experiences. Are they essentially the same? That's a different question than do they share characteristics. They obviously share characteristics, as this table shows. In the near-death experience, the patient is clinically dead. In the drug trip, they are not. That is a humongous difference, and I think that rules out the option to declare them essentially the same. So they both people who experienced drug trips and people who experienced near-death experiences in the study both experienced, or the patients experienced an unearthly environment in their drug trip and in their near-death experience. They experienced a profound sense of unity in their drug trip and in their near-death experience. They experienced extrasensory perceptions in their drug trip and in their near-death experience. They experienced ego dissolution in their drug trip and in their near-death experience. They did not experience a point of no return in their drug trip, while they did experience a point of no return in their near-death experience. Their drug trip and their near-death experience were both life-changing. Their drug trip and their near-death experience affected their sense of self, affected their thoughts about death, affected their thoughts about their relation to nature, and affected their worldview. In the study, the scientists performed a comparison of near-death experiences and psychedelic experiences. In the study, scientists recruited participants from social media, local news appearances, and scientific publications. The scientists asked the recruited participants to fill out a survey. So here's how they did the study. The participants were not paid to participate in the study, so nobody could say that money was provided to the subjects to get them to say what the scientists wanted them to say. Each participant had experienced at least one near-death experience and at least one psychedelic experience. So this seems like a good study to at least begin to look at the question: are the drug trips essentially the same? Because if people have had both, then they would be able to say, well, in the drug trip this happened, in this near-death experience this happened. And they would be able to tell differences between the two experiences. So this sounds like a good way to answer that question. There are details on the link above that I'm leaving out of this presentation. So I do recommend, though I'm spending a lot of time reading what the study said, there are things that I'm not including in the presentation, and I would recommend that you go back and look at it, because I don't want you to think I'm just telling you what I want you to see, because this study itself showed how near-death experiences and drug trips were similar, and it also showed how they were different. Participants were asked how many psychedelic experiences they had. They were asked multiple choice questions related to their near-death and psychedelic experiences. In fact, the questions are shown on a later slide, if I remember right. The participants, if participants had multiple of either type of experience, they were asked to respond about the most intense type of experience. So if they had 5 near-death experiences and 5 drug trips, they only responded based on the most severe drug trip and the most severe experience, or extreme drug trip. Responses were written by the participants. The approximate dates of the experiences were recorded. The cause of the NDE was recorded. They completed standardized questionnaires comparing the two types of experiences. The participants are providing the comparison between the experiences. In the study, the scientists asked 4 additional questions regarding the impression of reality and supernaturality for each experience. The questions are this: according to you, is this experience supernatural? The experience defined as the experience being attributed to something beyond scientific understanding or the laws of nature. That is the definition of something that's supernatural. It's beyond it's beyond the natural realm. Next question that they asked: at the time of the experience, did you consider that this experience was real or different from a dream or hallucination? There was a numerical scale in which that was graded. Also on a numerical scale, they asked them to answer, do you now consider this experience is real? So they were asked at the time of the experience if they thought it was real, and then at the time that they participated in the study, did they still consider the experience as real? And then they were also asked, when they actually die for real, did they think they'll experience something similar? In the study, the scientists then administered questions about the impact of the experiences. Then there were 7 additional items comparing the experiences, 4 of which assess the similarities and differences between the experiences. They were asked, to what extent would you say the near-death experience and psychedelic experience were similar? To what extent were you in a similar state of consciousness when comparing the near-death experience and psychedelic experience, in terms of being awake, unresponsive, unconscious, etc.? To what extent were the near-death experience and psychedelic experience similar in terms of sensory perception, when it pertains to visual, auditory, and bodily? And to what extent were the near-death experience and psychedelic experience similar in terms of emotions experienced? Responses to each of these 4 items were given on a Likert-type scale ranging from 1 to 5, 1 being not at all similar to 5 fully similar. The last 3 items were: which of these 2 experiences was most intense, which of these 2 experiences had a larger impact on your life, which of these 2 experiences had a more deeper metaphysical consequence on your life, affected your beliefs about the mind, reality, and the universe. For these last 7 items, respondents were invited to endorse the near-death experience or the psychedelic experience. Under materials, they used an NDEC scale, an EDI, an EII, an 11 ASC scale, an MCQ, a PIS, and statistics. We're going to define each of those. NDEC scale is a 20-item self-report scale used to assess the presence of an actual NDE. Additionally, this scale comprises 5 factors related to NDE phenomenology beyond the usual harmony, insight, border, and gateway. This multiple-choice questionnaire aims to quantify the richness of the experience with the total score ranging from 0 to 80 for each item. Scores are associated with a Likert format: 0, none, to 4, extreme. The EDI scale includes 8 items assessing experiences of ego dissolution. Responders are asked to give an estimate on visual analog scale format from 0 to 100 with incremental units of 1, with 0, no, not more than usual, and 100, yes, entirely or completely. The total score is the mean of 8 items. The higher the total score, the stronger the experience of ego dissolution. The EII scale contains 8 items to assess experiences of ego inflation. The items are designed to reflect the distinct experience of unusually elevated self-assuredness and confidence. Responders are asked to give an estimate on a VAS format from 0 to 100, with 0 being no, not more than usual, and 100, yes, entirely or completely. Total score is the mean of the 8 items. The higher the total score, the stronger the experience of ego inflation. The 11 ASC scale. Participants rated the content of their subjective experiences using the 11 ASC scale, containing 42 items in total. The 11 ASC questionnaire has 11 subscales. Those 11 subscales are experience of unity, spiritual experience, blissful state, insightfulness, disembodiment, impaired cognition and control, anxiety, complex imagery, elementary imagery, audiovisual synesthesia, and changed meaning of percepts. For each item, respondents were told to indicate their level of agreement on a VAS anchored from 0 to 100, where 0 is no, not more than usual, and yes, and 100 is yes, much more than usual. The mean score of all items results in the global ASC score. The modified version of the MCQ aims to assess memory characteristics using 16 rating scales assessing features of memory, feelings of re-experiencing, visual details, other sensory details, location, time, coherence, verbal component, emotional, while remembering belief that the event is real, one's own actions, words, and thoughts, visual perspective, emotional valence, personal importance of the memory, and reactivation frequency. A MCQ score, total score, can be derived summing all 16 items, each on a 7-point Likert scale, in reference to as the total amount of memory characteristics. The higher total score, the greater amount of memory characteristics. The PIS is a scale aiming to measure psychological insight after a psychedelic experience. It's a 7-item scale using a 0 to 100 VAS for each item. Total score can be calculated as the mean of ratings for items 1 to 6. Item 7 gives an index of behavioral change in association with potential insights gained in an experience. Statistics. All variables were tested for normality using the Shapiro-Wilk test. Results were expressed as mean and standard deviation or as medians with interquartile range for asymmetric distribution. Qualitative variables were described using count and percent based on data distribution. Paired samples t-tests or Wilcoxon sign rank tests were used to assess differences in continuous variables. They used McNemar's test for relations between categorical variables. X2 tests were used to assess frequency distributions. Results were considered at a p as less than 0.05 tailed. That's how they were considered significant. Bayesian analyses were used to complement frequentist analyses and establish if the evidence is sufficient to support the alternative or null hypothesis for each comparison. Bayesian statistics thus become relevant when attempting to establish whether the evidence supports the overlap between NDEs and PEs or the evidence supporting null hypothesis. Bayes factor 0.1 was used to establish the strength of the evidence. The Bayes factor 0.1 uses the Cauchy prior centered at 0, no prior preference considering the effect. They use the following cutoffs: the strong evidence for the alternative hypothesis, 3 to 10 substantial evidence for the alternative hypothesis, 1 to 3 anecdotal evidence for the alternative hypothesis, referring to the evidence that is considered as low or weak toward the alternative. I think H1 was the null hypothesis. That was remembering that from my college days. Out of 45 respondents, the final sample consisted of 31 respondents who had fully completed the online survey and experienced a classical NDE characterized by meeting the NDE scale criteria, experienced a life-threatening situation, a clearly identified context of an actual threat to life, a context leading to a coma that was greater than an hour, and a stay in the intensive care unit. And a psychedelic experience is the experience following the intake of one of those psychedelic drugs. 23 males, 7 females, and 1 unwilling to declare gender. Average age was 41 plus or minus 13. Varying levels of education. Most of the respondents were from the US or the UK. Everyone surveyed used psychedelic drugs more than once. So they would be able to they would be able to describe psychedelic experiences reasonably accurately since they've done them more than once. Now there's this table, and in this table, the age at which the near-death experience occurred was significantly lower than the one at which the psychedelic experience happened. The majority of the participants experienced their near-death experience before they experienced their psychedelic experience. So we can look at the table and we can see that near-death experience happened by anoxia, trauma, other non-trauma, and unknown causes. The psychedelic experience happened due to those drugs. Then it talks about the length of the coma, whether or not they were in intensive care. Some did not know how long their coma lasted and how long they stayed in intensive care. That was under results, that's the context of the experiences. Results, phenomenology. The NDE included more often the feeling of dying and or being dead as compared to the PE. There's a difference. The psychedelic experience more often included unusual sensations than did the near-death experience. The NDEC total score was significantly higher for the NDE as compared to the PE. Only 4 participants had a PE, which did not reach the cutoff score on the NDE scale. Bayesian analysis was used to complement the comparison of total NDEC scores between both groups, resulting BFO1 of 0.83 suggests only anecdotal support for the significant difference between the groups. Well, that's not shocking. I don't know what other kind of difference you'd want to look for. I mean, it's going to be people telling stories, anecdotes about what they experienced and how those two things differ. Bayesian analyses for each of these items revealed stronger overlaps between NDE and PE groups. Substantial support for the null hypothesis for alterations in time, perception, speeding thoughts, hearing a voice, peacefulness, seeing or feeling a bright light, precognition, life review, and feelings of non-existence. So in both the near-death experience and the psychedelic experience, they experienced time passing quickly. They experienced speeding thoughts. They experienced hearing a voice. They experienced peacefulness. They experienced seeing or feeling a bright light. They experienced precognition, life review, and feelings of non-existence. The disembodiment subscale of the ASC-11 was significantly higher in NDEs compared to PEs. Okay, there's another difference between drug trips and spiritual experiences. 3 other subscales of the ASC-11 were significantly higher for PEs compared to NDEs. Complex imagery, elementary imagery, change meaning of precepts, and all these comparisons showed substantial or strong evidence favoring the alternative hypothesis that there is a significant difference between an NDE and PE. So as you read through the study, there are various points in time where they say that they're essentially the same, and then they say that they're different. So in some areas, the drug trips are essentially the same as spiritual experiences. In other areas, they're not essentially the same. You can't take the atheist claim that drug trips are essentially the same as spiritual experiences and completely disregard the spiritual perspective like the materialist wants to do. No other significant differences were found. So there's a feather in the materialist cap. Substantial evidence for NDE and PE overlap was found for experience unity, spiritual experience, blissful state, and sightfulness scales, all which comprise the oceanic boundlessness dimension and the 5-dimension ASC, which has been previously linked to mystical type experiences. Also, substantial evidence for the null hypothesis that NDEs and PEs were similar was found for anxiety, impaired control, and cognition subscales. Comparison of the global ASC score revealed no significant differences between the NDE and PE. However, a BF01 of 2.06 only supports anecdotal evidence for this null finding. So here's the chart for both. Let's see. Appraisals and attribution of reality. For both the NDE and PE, more people attributed supernatural experiences than not. So people described both their NDE and their psychedelic experience as supernatural. More people described it as supernatural than did not. And people who experienced it thought when they die they would experience something similar. There's a lot who did not know, and that's interesting. The responses to the question at the time of the experience, did they think that the experience was real, were not significantly different between the near-death experience and the psychedelic experience. However, we found significantly higher scores for the near-death experience versus the psychedelic experience regarding the current attribution of reality. We observed that for the question at the time of the experience, you consider the experience was real or different from a dream or hallucination, 81% and 74% respectively reported that at the time of the experience they considered the near-death experience and the psychedelic experience more real than daily life. So both, and I've heard people who experience who claim to have experienced near-death experiences describe that near-death experience as more real than real life. Apparently both the near-death experience and the psychedelic experience can be described that way. 2 respondents, 6%, judged both the NDE and PE as real as daily life or usual reality. Or only 13% and 19% respectively, judged the NDE and PE as hallucination or imaginary. If you're going to call an NDE an hallucination, how can you do that if you're physically dead? It doesn't make sense that you'd be hallucinating anything if you're physically dead if your brain and your mind are the same thing. It doesn't make sense. For the question, do you now consider this experience as real, i.e. different from a dream or hallucination? 23 respondents, or 74%, and 21 respondents, or 68% respectively, reported they consider now that the NDE and PE were more real than daily life. 6, 19%, and 4, 13% respondents judge both the NDE and PE as real as daily life, usual reality. 2, 6%, and 6, 19% respectively judge the NDE and PE as hallucination or imaginary. Results, appraisals of attribution and reality. For both the NDE and PE, more people attributed supernatural experiences than not. For the question, do you now consider that this experience is real or different from a dream or hallucination? 23, or 74%, and 21, or 68% respectively, reported that they now consider the NDE and PE were more real than daily life. 6, or 19%, and 4, or 13% judged both the NDE and PE as real as daily life, usual reality. 2, 6%, and 6, 19% respectively judged the NDE and PE as hallucination or imaginary. For psychological insight and phenomenological memory characteristics. Here's the data. For the impact for both the NDE and PE, impact people's beliefs, worldviews, and lifestyles significantly. Having an NDE and PE decreased worry. The experiences were personally meaningful. The NDE was regarded as more negative than the PE. That's interesting. The NDE people were less afraid of death. That makes sense in the Christian worldview. Yeah. Then there were these questions. To what extent would you say the NDE and the PE were similar? Most people were right in the middle. About the same amount said not similar as said fully similar. And I guess most of them said they weren't sure. To what extent were the NDE and PE similar in terms of emotion experience? That was more consistent all across. To what extent were the NDE and PE similar in terms of sensory perception, being visual, auditory, and bodily? They weren't similar at all, overwhelmingly. To what extent were you in a similar state of consciousness when experiencing the NDE and PE in terms of being awake, unresponsive, or conscious? Those were surprisingly mixed. The group judged the NDE as slightly more intense than the PE. The NDE had a much larger impact on life than the PE. PE had more deeper metaphysical consequences. That's interesting. Scientists observed a substantial overlap in altered sense, time, peacefulness, seeing or having the feeling of being surrounded by a bright light, precognition, life review, and experiencing a feeling of non-existence or void. The scientists observed two significant differences regarding the feeling of dying or being dead. The feeling of dying or being dead was stronger in NDEs compared with PEs, and the existence of unusual sensations was stronger for PEs than it was for NDEs. The NDEC total score was significantly higher for the NDE as compared with the PE. However, the Bayesian analyses revealed that the evidence supporting this difference is only anecdotal, and further data are needed to determine the difference. Unusual sensations were stronger for the PE compared with the NDE. The disembodiment was stronger with the NDE than compared with classic psychedelics, revealing how sensory modalities are differently altered in both experiences. Bayesian analyses revealed that while sensory modalities appear to differ between these experiences, a significant overlap can be found with regard to mystical type effects as determined with the subscales. Spiritual experience, experiencing unity in lifelessness and blissful state. Thus, our results reveal an overlap in mystical-like effects, while low-level phenomena, sensory effects, diverged between both experiences, as demonstrated by the responses to the 11DASC. You can't say they're essentially the same because there are similarities, but there are also differences. While we did not find significant differences between ego dissolution and inflation between the two experiences, Bayesian analyses implied that evidence supporting an overlap was merely anecdotal, meaning that it is not strong. Further research is needed to explore whether self-related processing is equally disrupted in both experiences. Overall, these results are partially consistent with findings from the NDEC scale and reveal some overlap between psychedelic and NDEs when it comes to mystical type effects, but not for sensory effects, which appear to differ in both states. Although overlap between the phenomenology of classic PEs and NDEs was highlighted in Moody's bestseller, the study done here is the first group qualitative study exploring within subject comparison between both types of experience. When asked about their attributions at the time of the experience, a high percentage of respondents attributed their NDE, 74%, and PE, 68%, as being more real than daily life. By contrast, only 19%, 13% of respondents considered the NDE, PE as equally real as daily life, and a minority, only 6 and 19%, respectively, considered the NDE and PE as real as hallucination or imagination. In parallel, regarding the current attribution of reality, the NDE was considered to be more real than the content experienced during the PE, consistent with finding the NDEs have a strong impact on beliefs and notions regarding death. One can hypothesize as the NDE is more often associated with the impression of super real due to its unexpected and involuntary occurrences occurred as compared to the PE, which is typically intended. Indeed, for PEs, the individual knows he or she is taking a drug. Here's a big difference. The person knows they're taking a drug, and they generally know they're not in a life-threatening situation. They don't plan on being in a life-threatening situation when they're taking a PE. Consequently, the interpretation or the meaning of the experience may differ between both because of this context. However, it's worth mentioning that our respondents reported particularly high scores on the Likert associated with this question on the impression of reality for PEs too. It's possible that both psychedelics and NDEs carry with them a strong attribution of reality due to the sense of insight with a strong feeling of certainty and mystical type effects. This noetic quality has been characterized as a feature of experience in which insights feel meaningful and fundamental while also having unmediated quality, which grants them a lasting impact in the individual. Regarding other attributions, we found overlaps for the supernatural attribution to both experiences, as well as for a question asking to what extent they think that when they actually die, they will experience something similar. We also found a meaningful overlap between NDEs and PEs regarding psychological insights and associated behavioral changes. For both experiences, psychological insight and associated behavioral changes adopted after the experiences were scored relatively highly compared to the original validation data. Participants who have consumed psychedelics for this new measure. Although the phenomena of the psychological insight after PE is now beginning to be measured, insights and associated new behaviors acquired after an NDE have not been studied. This is relevant as insights and subsequent behavior changes have been found to mediate mental health benefits attributed to psychedelics, and a similar mechanism may be at play during NDEs. It seems there's also a substantial overlap between NDE and PE in terms of long-term psychological changes. Among all questions administered regarding the potential impact of experiences, only 3 show significant differences. At least those differences are called significant. Respondents reported being more friendly and open towards others after the PE compared to the NDE. That's interesting. They also reported the NDE not only had a more negative impact on their life, but also was less afraid of death anymore as a consequence of the NDE compared to the PE. Finding of reduced anxiety regarding death after the NDE is consistent with previous research. While there are so far no empirical studies exploring the processes underlying this reduction in fear of death, one can hypothesize that this may be due to the nature of the NDE itself, or the perception of death as a transition to another phase of existence rather than complete annihilation. By contrast, the negative impact of the NDE may have been due to various other aspects of the experience, such as the context and the difficulty in describing it afterwards. Finally, for discussion questions assessing the potential similarity between both experiences where the participants had to endorse either the NDE or the PE yielded very mixed results. This could be attributed to the fact that these experiences constitute heterogeneous categories of subjective experiences. For instance, due to the variability of ingested substances or the diversity of context, and or that they possess both similarities and differences at various levels, as shown by the results of the various questionnaires, and that the questions were so broad, which may have made each respondent focus on different aspects of the experiences when answering. As such, these direct answers are generic and prone to biases of judgment and recollection, and reflect the value of the separate assessment of phenomenology between NDE and PE experiences in several dimensions of interest. It's important to acknowledge the limitations of the present study, which warrant caution when extrapolating these findings. First, our study relied on self-report questionnaire formats and some self-constructed items that were not validated. The content and style of our questions may be prone to biases linked to first-person measures such as correct inferences on study demand characteristics, biases outcomes in favor of our prior hypotheses. Since our goal was to study subjective experiences, we necessarily relied on retrospective subjective measures, but this does not prevent that subjective measures may be biased by memory distortions. One can nonetheless observe that the ratings obtained on the MCQ were particularly high, as opposed to what can be typically found in the literature for non-NDE event memories. This suggests that both types of experiences are associated with a substantial number of features, whether sensory, contextual, semantic, and or emotional, that characterize the phenomenological experience associated with remembering. In addition, the use of questionnaires has the advantage of qualitatively assessing the relevant phenomena using validated tools in some cases, and the testing specific hypotheses. However, the questionnaires may limit the exploration of the broader phenomenology associated with these experiences and may also be vulnerable to demand characteristics, which previous research has found may be exacerbated in psychedelic-like experiences. Related to this issue, there's also the issue of specificity, referring to the possibility that respondents tend to endorse a broad array of concepts without being really specific. We're currently performing parallel analyses exploring qualitative responses from the same individuals to refine the phenomenological overlap between these experiences. Second, volunteers enrolled in the study were self-selected and hence might not be representative of a broader population. Third, the present sample is relatively small. Given the specificity of this population who have experienced both types of experiences, the recruitment of volunteers was arduous. Future studies should include a larger group of volunteers. Another limitation is the retrospective design of our study, which does not allow us to determine conclusions about the causal influence of these experiences on their reported impact. Another limitation is the self-constructed nature of several of our measures and their lack of formal validation to work to demonstrate their construct validity. Another limitation is that none of our respondents did experience 5-MeO-DMT. That's one of the psychedelic drugs, apparently. Some previous work has suggested that this compound may especially produce effects that share striking phenomenological similarities with NDEs. That drug is of particular interest as it tends to produce less visual imagery compared to other psychedelics, and thus may match better subjective effect profile of NDEs we found. Future within-subject comparison studies should explore the overlap between that drug and the NDE to address this possibility. So, there are some good things that came out of the study. There are some more questions that came out of the study. But again, I would like to submit that there are tons of people who would have experienced a drug trip that did not experience a near-death experience. And there will be many people who experience an NDE that do not experience drug trips. I'm not even sure what good it does for the skeptic to say, well, that a supposed spiritual experience is essentially just the same as a drug trip, because you have to have some way of explaining how people would have such spiritual experiences if their brain is dead, if they're declared brain dead, if they're having these types of experiences while being declared brain dead, and they've never done the drugs that produce those kind of drug trips, then what would be the best explanation for the nature of the spiritual experience? Related to this issue, there's also the issue of specificity, referring to the possibility that respondents tend to endorse a broad array of concepts without being really specific. They're currently performing parallel analyses, exploring qualitative responses from the same individuals to refine the phenomenological overlap between these experiences. Second, volunteers enrolled in the study were self-selected and hence might not be representative of the broader population. Third, the present sample is relatively small. Given the specificity of this population who have experienced both types of experiences, the recruitment of volunteers was arduous. Further studies should include a larger group of volunteers. Another limitation is the retrospective design of our study, which does not allow us to determine the conclusions about the causal influence of these experiences on their reported impact. Another limitation is the self-constructed nature of several of our measures and their lack of formal validation work to demonstrate their construct validity. Another limitation is that none of our respondents did experience that type of drug. Some previous work suggested this compound may essentially produce effects that share striking phenomenological similarities to NDEs. That drug is of particular interest as it tends to produce less visual imagery compared to other psychedelics, and thus may match better the subjective effect profile of NDEs. Future within subject comparison studies should explore the overlap between that drug and the NDE to address this possibility. Overall, the results of the present study are consistent with the existing literature suggesting some overlap between NDEs, their attribution, and their psychological impact. Intriguingly, we report here that the phenomenology of both experiences share so-called mystical-like features while diverging in sensory ones. Future work could explore if the degree of overlap of the experience induced by atypical psychedelics is stronger with NDEs compared with serotonergic psychedelics in individuals who have had both experiences. It's interesting that in the scientific study, they acknowledge that people do have NDEs. Some materialists will deny that this is even a thing because NDE would have to occur in a disembodied mind since the body is dead. So, an interesting study nonetheless. I do not expect that this study will completely satisfy the objections of the materialist to the reality of NDEs, but I do think that at various parts of the study, it highlighted some significant differences between NDEs and drug trips. And again, I think it's telling that there are people who have NDEs who have never done the types of drugs that produce drug trips. So how, in what reason would the person experiencing the NDE have the same things happening in their brain or similar things happening in their brains as those who do the drugs that produce drug trips? That just doesn't make sense. What seems to make more sense is that there's an all-powerful God who's giving special experiences, people he chooses for reasons he chooses, and allows these people to come back and tell others about those experiences so that they will hopefully help others come to the knowledge of the truth. So thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and have a blessed rest of your day.
I see the evidence of your good.